Okay. Got it.
You're recording?
Nope.
Okay.
All right, I'm glad one of us is important enough to pull off that stunt. So, okay, so I'm hoping you guys can all see the title slide for this presentation. Heads nodding up and down means yes. Awesome. Okay, so basically what we want to do today is talk a little bit about produce food safety. You know, there's always this question whenever we talk about produce food safety. Number one, what have you heard? And number two, why is it important? So, you know, we get all types of reactions as we travel the state and do this type of work. You know, there's a lot of mixed feelings about this. You know, why it might be important, why we even deal with it to begin with. So again, when we look at the big picture, if you look at CDC estimates, each year they estimate that each year 48 million Americans get sick from something that they ate, from a foodborne illness, which translates into roughly 1 in 6 people, or about 3,000 deaths. The thing they don't count here is the cost of treating those 128,000 hospitalizations, et cetera. So again, it's a pretty expensive issue. Understand that these are estimates for the simple reason that for an outbreak to occur, 2 or more people have to become ill with the same strain of pathogen. That has to be documented. There has to be testing. So in a lot of cases, people don't go to the doctor. They tough it out. So the thinking is that really these estimates may be vastly underreported. So when we look at this, one thing that does become pretty clear when you look at the numbers is that fresh produce has been responsible for up to 46% of reported foodborne illnesses and about 23% of all deaths. So, you know, it seems kind of like a conundrum here, or a paradox, that we know that fresh produce is good for us. It's an important part of a healthy diet. And yet we see that on the other side of that, fresh produce is causing up to 46% of all documented foodborne illnesses. Now, why we see that, there's a lot of different reasons. First off, Americans are buying more fresh produce. That's a good thing. But of course, the more that we purchase, the more that we produce, the greater the chance that something could slip into the system, or that someone could get sick from something they eat. We see a wide range of consumer health. We've got a lot of folks in the population that we probably would not have had 30 or 40 years ago that are immunocompromised, folks that have had transplants, folks that are taking immunosuppressing drugs. I've heard reports that at any given time, up to 25% of the population may be immunocompromised. Detection and reporting systems have improved. We're getting better at detecting this foodborne illness. And the other thing we're seeing is that human pathogens associated with other commodities are now being associated with produce. It wasn't that long ago, if you heard about someone getting sick from E. coli, your mind automatically went to undercooked meat, you know, as opposed to romaine lettuce. Salmonella, that was something you thought about in association with poultry or pork. And now that's something that unfortunately we're seeing in cantaloupe and other commodities. So again, we're starting to see these pathogens associated with other commodities. And when we look at the causes of illness, we see 3 main types of organisms that are involved. Bacteria, which are single-celled organisms that live independently. Parasites, intestinal worms or microscopic protozoa that live in a host or a human, and then viruses, which are small particles that live in a host and can only replicate in a host. So again, these are the 3 main types of organisms that we're dealing with when we talk about pathogens, human pathogens that cause foodborne illness. By and large, in produce, we find that bacteria are the main cause of illness. If you look at the numbers, the vast majority of foodborne illnesses can be traced back to bacteria when we're talking about fresh produce. Now, in the whole wide world of food, viruses, specifically norovirus, may be the number one culprit, but where produce is concerned, we see that bacteria more often than not are involved. The three most common are Salmonella, E. coli 0157H7, and Listeria monocytogenes. All could potentially make someone sick, and all are kind of a tongue twister to say. Okay, so the problem with bacteria is that they can rapidly multiply. One cell, if you give it ideal conditions, in 24 hours can turn into 17 million cells. Now, I do want to point out that that is under ideal conditions. The key with food safety is that we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're not creating those ideal conditions where bacteria can get into the system and start to multiply. One of the things that we see is that most of these microbes are found in nature. They're just a part of the environment. We'll see these microbes in soil, people, water, manure, livestock, pets, wildlife. I joke quite a bit that one of these days I'm going to revise these slides and add air, because that's really about the only thing that we've not put on the list. But the idea is that we see these things, these microbes in nature. They're just a part of the environment. Excuse me. The other thing that complicates the issue is that washing doesn't really equal safe when we're talking about produce. If you look at the image, I think this is one of Amanda's pictures, and it's a dandy. This is Salmonella on the surface of a cantaloupe. And I think this might be the netting, if I'm not mistaken. But if you look, to the naked eye, the netting looks like just a raised area. But if you look at it under the microscope, it really does start to look like a good old southern Indiana cave system. And you can see the bacteria are right there against the sides or in those protected areas. So, again, washing isn't really going to dig out a lot of those bacteria. And with surface tensions as such, it's going to be real hard to get a sanitizer down there that to have any effectiveness also. So washing really doesn't equal safe. Again, we're showing this with this image where the bacteria are actually getting into the stomates or into the holes in the leaf. And then once they do that, they're internalized, they're just in the leaf tissue, and there's no way you're going to be able to get those out of there. The biggest problem is that produce by its very nature is, fresh produce is by its very nature unprocessed. There's not a kill step to reduce the microbial populations before we eat the stuff. So, I joke around that what we should do is like the meat people, and when we put together our bag of leafy greens, put a sticker on it that says heat to an internal temperature of 135 degrees. I'm not sure how that would taste, but frankly, it doesn't sound appealing at all. But the idea is that there isn't a kill step. Fresh produce is by its very nature fresh. So really it can be contaminated at any point during production. It could be contaminated in the field, the packing line, while we're storing, during transport, or even at the market. So what we recommend is that growers reduce on-farm risk by using good agricultural practices. And these are the things that we do, or the growing practices, conditions, things we do that are going to minimize the risk of microbial contamination. Whenever we do use GAPs or good ag practices on our farms, we see some other benefits. Clearly, there's going to be a public health benefit if you're doing everything you can to reduce the risk of a human pathogen contaminating your produce. Then, obviously there's going to be a public health benefit. In some cases, when we do use GAPs, we see an extension of shelf life because we're reducing some of the other microbes that might cause post-harvest rots. We're seeing an increase in quality. Other benefits might be that we're performing due diligence, and we might be reducing our liability risk by having a food safety program in place. So how do we get started with this? Well, the first thing would be GAPS training. And that's what we're doing today is just a little bit of an introduction to good ag practices and produce food safety. Once we're finished today, we would hope that you go out to your farm and just do a walk around. Take a look at those at your operation and see if you can spot some places where maybe you're taking on a little more risk than you should. I don't know about the rest of you, but down here in southern Indiana, it's about 61 degrees and the wheat is starting to green up, and it's a really good day to just get out and walk the farm if you don't mind a little rain. So anyway, the next step would be to outline a food safety plan and then write the food safety plan. We recommend that growers have a formal written plan that will guide them in their food safety efforts. And then, of course, the last step is to implement the plan. It kind of defeats the purpose if you write it and just stick it on the shelf. And of course, don't forget to inform consumers of your on-farm food safety practices. I kind of question this some days because food safety isn't really a place where we want to compete. But at the same time, if it's something you're doing that your competitor is not, then it is definitely a way to help differentiate your products. The bottom line in all of this is that all growers who introduce produce into the public food supply should be concerned about food safety. If we're using our products for personal use, then really we can do whatever we want. But when we start to introduce produce into the public food supply and into commerce, that's when we have to step up and take on that extra level of responsibility to make sure we're producing our products with as little risk as possible. Whenever we institute a GAPS program or do good ag practices on farm, what we see is that our prevention or risk reduction can fall into four broad categories, something we affectionately refer to as the 4 W's: water, waste, wildlife, and workers. And if you can reduce your risk in these 4 areas, you're going to go a long way to reducing your overall risk across the farm. So let's talk a little bit about water. Who am I kidding? Let's talk a lot about water. It's a major risk factor. Okay, so water is the major source of contamination for fresh fruits and vegetables. Why? Because water is an excellent vector. Some of the things we might find in water would be E. coli, Salmonella, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora. So again, water is an excellent vector of some of these pathogens. The other thing that we see is that water is used for a lot of different things on the farm: irrigation, pesticide application, frost protection, post-harvest washing. So it seems like we're always using water in some form. So because we're using so much of it and because it can serve as a vector, we really need to pay attention to how we're managing water from a food safety perspective. In general, water on the farm can come from 3 sources: either municipal or rural water systems, what we call city water down here, or it could come from groundwater, which would be wells or springs, or surface water, ponds, ditches, streams, rivers, sources that are open to the environment. And the water source is going to determine, in a large part, the risk we're looking at and the things we need to do to mitigate that risk. Municipal water systems are the least likely to be contaminated. The reason for that is because water systems must legally sell potable water. It has to be of drinking water quality with 0 detectable generic E. coli. So what we recommend is that as you institute your food safety system, if you're using municipal water or city water sources, make sure that you have a copy of their most recent water quality test on file. You want to update that at least annually. Stick that in their file, and that's your proof for your demonstration that you're using water that is of a safe and adequate quality. When we look at wells, generally water coming from groundwater sources, from wells, etc., there's medium risk, minimal, there's, I guess, intermediate risk. And a lot of the risk we see doesn't so much come from the water itself, but it does come from the potential for a cracked well casing or contamination of the well itself. So in order to protect wells and reduce our risk, what we recommend is that you don't mix pesticides or other chemicals near the well. Don't apply solid manure near the well. And again, the state of Indiana has some setback regulations for manure application as well. Use backflow prevention fittings when you're applying ag chemicals. If you're fertigating or chemigating, make sure there's a check valve somewhere on the system between your injection site and the well. If you're not using the well, make sure that it's capped and it's retired properly. Keep livestock away from the recharge area. And we like to see folks inspect those wells at least annually to make sure that everything is in working order. Surface water is the most likely to be contaminated. And a lot of that is because you really can't manage or control what's flying over the water or what's swimming in the water. So again, surface water carries the greatest amount of risk. We see risk from runoff, from wind dispersal, from animal facilities, improperly treated sewage, wildlife. So there's any number of things that could potentially contaminate surface water simply because it's more unprotected.
Scott, we have a question. How far is it recommended? What is the recommended distance from the well to where you're mixing your pesticides?
I don't know that there's any hard and fast regulation, but I would like to see personally, depending on the way that the topography lies, at least 25 to 50 feet or more. And of course, making sure that there's a check valve in that system. I see a lot of systems where we've got a well, we've got a pipe coming out of the well, and it branches. One pipe goes to the irrigation system and one pipe goes to this overhead apparatus where guys pull the sprayer underneath and start filling. Which in that case, if it's close, you might think about some kind of containment, whether that's a concrete retaining wall or some kind of a dike or something, just to protect that well. But in general, I would say at least 25 to 50 feet is something that I would be comfortable with. And of course, regardless of what you're doing, just make sure there's a check valve there somewhere in that system. So.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so surface water, again, very hard to protect, or at least can be hard to protect. So what we want to do is we want to keep the livestock out of the water and out of the drainages to water as best we can. A lot of our ponds, a lot of our lakes in this region are fed by runoff. On our property, we can kind of manage where we put the livestock, but it's very hard if your neighbor is using the grass waterway where it goes onto his property to graze cattle or whatever. So again, we do the best we can, understanding that since most of our ponds are fed by runoff, sometimes it's very hard to manage, what's going on in that recharge area. Again, if manure is used, apply it away from surface water. If you're storing manure, make sure it's managed in such a way that you're not going to have any runoff into that water source. And then, we may also have to upgrade our sewage systems. There's still a lot of places out in the rural areas where the septic system consists of a tank, a pipe, and a ditch. So, the three-part system. So again, we need to be cognizant of that and making sure we understand where that water is coming from. And, that may mean upgrading systems. Whenever we're irrigating, we need to think about what that water is contacting. Now, water contacting the edible portion of the crop near harvest poses the greatest risk. So the more contact we have with the edible portion of the crop, the greater risk we have that water is going to potentially contaminate the crop or introduce a human pathogen into the crop. So when we look at irrigation, drip irrigation has the lowest risk, and that's basically because we're putting the water in the root zone. It's not, in most cases, unless we're growing root crops, it's not going to wet the edible portion of the crop. And if we use drip irrigation with plastic mulch, that's even more effective because that's going to give us an additional barrier should that drip tape spring a leak. And my experience has been that it does frequently. Rodents like to chew on it. Dogs love to dig it up. So if you've got that plastic mulch on there, it's just an added barrier, an extra layer of protection should something happen. Overhead irrigation is seen to have the highest risk of crop contamination, and that's basically because it wets the edible portion of the crop. So if there's something in the water, generally what happens is that it can easily be transferred to the edible portion of the crop. Okay, water testing. Water tests are used to track water quality. We don't use tests for daily monitoring. You could, but at $35 to $40 per pop, that could get very, very expensive. So we use water testing as a way to track our water quality and to understand our water quality over time. Records of test dates and results are important to establish patterns. So if we test over a number of months or a number of years, a change in any pattern may indicate a problem or possible fecal contamination. We recommend that people test regularly. Some growers, if they are covered by the produce safety rule, may be obligated to test more frequently. Growers that are doing third-party audits, they may be required to test more frequently. But at a minimum, we recommend that surface water be tested yearly before you use it, and then regularly, at least monthly, during use. Well water, we want to test that at least yearly. And then municipal water, yearly, we want to go down to the water company and get a copy of their most recent test and put that in our file. Where do I collect samples? Well, for surface water and groundwater, the idea is to take a representative sample appropriate for the water source. So remember, you're wanting a representative sample. The bottom line here is that it's impossible for us to test every ounce of water that is used or goes onto the field. So when we pull these samples, we really want to be careful and make sure we're pulling samples that most closely represent the water that we think is going out to the field. And of course, with municipal water or public water, there's no sampling required if you have the testing reports. And, even at that, if you do have questions, you can always test at different points in your distribution system on farm. How do we collect samples? There's a lot to be said for technique when you're collecting samples. The first thing you want to do is follow all sample submission instructions from the lab. Talk to the lab before you ever go out to pull samples. Make sure that you've talked to your lab, that you know where those samples need to go, what the times are that they require between sampling and sample submission. And usually the lab's going to have their own bottles or jars that they want you to use. These are going to be sterile. They might have a few thiosulfate crystals in the bottom to kill any chlorine. But again, make sure that you talk to the lab before you go out and start sampling. You don't rinse the bottles before sampling. And again, if you look at the sampling from a hydrant or from a well, what we recommend is that you sample, if you're sampling the water source, that you go to the first spigot in the distribution system. So if you're sampling from a well or groundwater, what you want to do is sanitize that rim, either flame it with a cigarette lighter or take a little bleach on a cloth and clean that off. Then you want to run that water for at least 3 to 5 minutes. That way you're cleaning out the pipes and you're sampling what's coming out of the well, not what's been sitting in the pipes. Then you very quickly open that jar, fill it, close it, put it on ice, and get it to the lab. So again, there's a lot to be said for technique. I tell the story of a guy that called me one time, and he had pulled a water test, and his water test had been pretty good, but for some reason this test just was off the charts, contaminated and messed up. So I went out and took a look, and I asked him where he took his sample. So he pointed to the spot. And the short story is that he had a hydrant with 50 feet of garden hose on it. The garden hose was lying in dust at the edge of the driveway next to a pen of feeder pigs. And when he took the sample, he had basically turned on the hydrant, shot the water out of the end of the hose, and then put the lid on the sample jar and sent it in. We took the hose off, sanitized the rim, let the water run for 3 to 5 minutes, pulled a quick grab sample, sent it to the lab, and it came back with 0 detectable generic E. coli. So again, there's a lot to be said for technique. If we're going and sampling from a pond or a lake, we really want to try to get out, in at least 2 to 3 feet of water if we can. There's a nice spot between the bottom and the surface that we can sample in that usually gives pretty good results. If we're walking out there, we want to try to lean forward enough that we're not sampling the sediments that we're kicking up. So again, another place I like to sample for water, if we can get out on a dock, just lie down on a dock and reach down and get into some deeper water and pull the sample that way. The thing to remember with ponds or lakes is that any rain event, anything, temperature changes, all these have the potential to stir up the ponds and alter the testing results. So again, if we do have a heavy rain, you might want to hold off a few days before you go out and sample the pond, just to let it settle down. And again, that's not cheating in my mind. If we're, nobody's going to irrigate after a heavy rain to begin with. They're going to wait at least, 4 or 5 days. So if we do the same with our pond, that water is going to more accurately represent what's going out to the field than if we had sampled just right after a heavy rain. So again, there's a lot to be said for technique when we collect our water samples. Where do we go for testing? Find a lab that is certified by state and local agencies or third-party accreditors. Make sure the lab can provide the test you need. In most cases, we're going to be testing for generic E. coli. Those who are covered by the produce safety rule may have some more stringent requirements. But make sure that also that the lab provides sampling instructions. And Terry, this might be a really good time to talk about the lab handout that you developed, if you have that handy.
Yeah. Do you want me to show it, Scott, or just talk through it real quick?
Well, if you've got it handy, I'll stop sharing if you would like to show that to everyone.
Yes, I will pull that up. So everybody, I just dropped a link into the chat box to this Indiana Water Testing Lab map. So I'll show that to you guys real quick. So this map here shows water testing labs in the state that will test your water for generic E. coli, like Scott talked about. And if you're covered by the produce safety rule, all of the labs on this list will use a method that's recognized by the FDA. So we've already done all of the legwork for you and verified that these labs will do that. So if you can see where they are on the map here, and then if you scroll down, you can see the contact information, the address, and all of that here for each lab. So you do need to contact the lab before you request a test, just to make sure you understand all of the requirements for testing, and you can ask about cost and all of that when you contact them. But this is a great place to start if you aren't sure where to go for your water testing. If you are using your water for agricultural water, so you're doing irrigation or anything while the produce is still growing, there's a good chance you're going to want a number for your test, especially if you're covered by the produce safety rule. You want to make sure you get testing that's quantitative, where they'll give you the actual number of E. coli in that sample. And if you want that, then you need to make sure you find one that has a purple dot here. If you're only using your water for post-harvest purposes, so washing or hand washing or equipment cleaning or something like that, you can do presence absence just to see if there's E. coli or not, and you can go to a lab with an orange dot. So that if you guys have questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. Like I said, I posted the link in the chat box, and it's on the safeproducein.com website.
Okay. So the next question, when we submit these samples, how are they tested? And really the most general method or the most general technique is to take some of that water and that you submit to the lab and put it on a petri dish. And then they're going to let that incubate for a period of time. And then the folks at the lab are going to count colonies and tell you what's in the water. They're going to use petri dishes with a medium in there that's going to be selective, possibly differential, so that you can, so they can tell very quickly if there's any E. coli or anything like that in the water. But generally we use E. coli, generic E. coli, as the preferred indicator of fecal contamination. And this is one of those things that the food safety folks love to argue about, what is the best indicator. But honestly, FDA, when they put together and wrote the produce safety rule, determined that this was the one that they would accept or that they would use. So we use indicators simply because we can't measure every ounce of water that we use. The E. coli is not a direct measure of the presence of human pathogens, but what this indicator does is it gives us a measure or an idea of the quality of the water. So if you look at the picture here, we have in the whole wide world bacteria called total coliforms, and a subset of those are the fecal coliforms. Why? Because, yep, you guessed it, that's exactly where they live and where they're found. And then as a subset of that, we have the generic E. coli. And then if you divide it out further, you see that we get into some of the pathogenic E. coli. So by testing for generic E. coli, we know that if we're seeing generic E. coli, there's a higher probability that we're going to see some of these pathogenic E. colis. The other thing we know from research is that when we see generic E. coli in the water, there's been some type of contamination event. So there's an increased probability that there could be Salmonella, Cryptosporidium, hepatitis, or some of these other pathogens in your water. So again, that's why we use generic E. coli as an established indicator. When you get those test results back from the lab, they're generally expressed as colony forming units per 100 milliliters of water. So basically, when they grow out the colonies on the Petri dish, they'll count those colonies. The assumption is that one bacterium was what initiated every colony on the Petri dish. So they refer to that bacterium as a colony forming unit, something capable of forming a colony. So they'll count that, and then they'll multiply that so that it's expressed as units per 100 milliliters of water, just so it's a standardized method of reporting. So if we took a Petri dish and counted, and we put a milliliter of water on there and we counted 5 colonies, then we would multiply that up and report that as 500 colony forming units, or 500 CFU per 100 milliliter of water. In general, water that exceeds 126 colony forming units, generic E. coli per 100 mil water, is considered too contaminated to use for production. Now, is water any safer at 125 than at 126? That's debatable, but this is kind of the number that we have that's been used as sort of the limit. The Purdue safety rule, for those who are covered by that, if your profiles and your measures exceed this, then you have to do a corrective action. But 126 is generally considered the line for what is acceptable as far as water to use for irrigation. And this comes from EPA standards for recreational water. The idea is that if, until research allows us to know more, the logic is if it's too contaminated to swim in, it's probably too contaminated to be irrigating with. Something to remember is that a bad water test will not put you out of business. It basically indicates an additional risk factor that has to be mitigated. So how do we do that? Well, there are three corrective measures that are allowed under the produce safety rule. First off, they allow us to apply a time interval for microbial die-off. So you can assume a half log die-off for up to 4 days. If your water is a little bit above that 126 threshold, then one might irrigate and then wait 4 days and then harvest and assume that the microbes have died off. This is not something that I would personally put a lot of confidence in, simply because our climate is highly variable. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's sunny, sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cooler. It's not like being out in Central Valley of California, where we're going to have continuously sunny days with, where we can predict the weather with a little bit more accuracy. But again, that is something we could do as a corrective action. The other thing we could do if we start getting a bad water test is reinspect the water system, identify problems, make necessary changes, and confirm effectiveness. I joke around that if we as a group ever rediscover common sense, I'm probably out of a job. And this just kind of proves it. I mean, just common sense all the way. Reinspect the water system, fix the problem, make sure it's fixed, and go on. It just doesn't get any simpler than that. And then the third option would be to treat the water. So when we treat water, we need to ask ourselves, is this an ongoing or repeated problem? Do we think it's just a one-time deal? Is this something we're seeing continuously? We can treat wells. We can do chlorine treatment if we need to, but you need to do that in conjunction with state regulatory agencies. In Indiana, it's the Department of Environmental Management that has oversight for such things. So you really need to check with them before you start to do any type of well treatment. Surface water treatment, you can treat surface water. The water may be treated inline. There are different compounds that exist to treat the water. Labeled chlorine compounds, peracetic acid compounds. And the other thing too is if the water's too contaminated, we may just simply have to find a new water source. One thing that I would call your attention to is the line at the bottom of the slide. Always use a labeled product and follow label directions. Sanitizers legally are considered to be pesticides. So as with all pesticides, the label is the law. Make sure you're using it in the appropriate manner at the appropriate labeled rates. So I think at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over if someone else would like to talk about post-harvest water for a little bit.
Sure, I can take over. So like Scott said, we use this water for so many different things. And post-harvest, so this is after you're taking the fruit or vegetables from the field and you're doing something with it later. So you could wash it for hydrocooling if you use ice. Dump tanks. There was a picture earlier when they had all the lettuce in there and they were washing it. So that's a good example of a dump tank. So we use this water for a lot of different things. So that's why post-harvest water is important. So unlike the wiggle room we had with production water, we cannot have any detectable E. coli per 100 mils. And the reason being is that this is the same water we're going to be drinking, right? And how Terry said before, if this water is what you use for everything, so this could, if you have a well and that's what you use for drinking and that's what you use for irrigation, well, then you don't have to worry about doing that enumeration where you get a number. Just do the presence absence test. It's cheaper. And because really you can't have any, so presence, if it's there, we have to do something. So this is an example here of, what it is demonstrating this concept of infiltration. And how this happens is when you have the temperature of the fruit is much different than the temperature of the water. So for example, here with this tomato, think of a really hot tomato. You just harvested it, you know, it's July, it's very hot. And then you take it and you dump it in icy cold water. And Scott and I actually did this experiment, and it does happen. We were skeptical for several years, I think, until we did it ourselves. And so what they did here to show that this water can be sucked in if we have this huge temperature difference is they take a blue dye and they put it up here on the stem scar of the tomato. And so again, hot tomato in icy cold water. And you can see that over time, this blue dye is sucked into the interior of the tomato. So you can just imagine, say you had bacteria that were present on that stem scar or any scar on that tomato or fruit or cantaloupe or whatever you're dealing with, bacteria could then be sucked into the inside. And so once it's in the inside, there's not much we can do, right? The only thing we could really do is cook it to get rid of it. So we want to avoid that. So what can you do? Well, you can cool down your produce a little bit, or you could heat up your water a little bit to try to minimize that. Yeah, that's good, Scott. So there's a bunch of different sanitizers we can use. And so these sanitizers, well, first let me say, there's nothing saying you have to wash your produce. So no, unless your buyer is saying you have to. So you may decide you want to wash your produce because you think it looks better, you think your customers will buy it more readily, and that's great. You totally can do that. And if you are washing your produce, you may want to put in a post-harvest sanitizer. Again, there's nothing saying that if you wash your produce, you have to use a sanitizer. You don't have to. And I just saw a question come into the chat. Yeah, so the question is it actually safer to not wash the produce before going out? And in some cases, that's true. So if you mess up this post-harvest washing step and say you introduce contamination at some point, then you could be making it a much worse than if you didn't wash it all. So yes, so you do have to keep that in mind. So however, there's some buyers that they want you to wash it. So sometimes you just have to do that. So if you do choose to use a sanitizer, we have a lot of options available. And again, you can see that link in there, and that's also on our webpage, the safeproducein.com webpage. You can find the list of sanitizers that are approved for washing fruits and vegetables. And like Scott said, the label is the law. So it has to say somewhere on the label, approved for fruit and vegetable washing or something along that line. So a lot of the sanitizers we have available are chlorine-based, proxyacetic acid-based, ozone, UV can be used. So we do have a lot of options with sanitizers should you choose to use it. Okay. So what do sanitizers do? I'll just get through a few more slides and then we can take our quick break. So what do sanitizers do? They kill the bacteria in the water. They kill the bacteria that's on the surface of the produce, and they also prevent cross-contamination. So you can imagine, so envision that dump tank scenario where you generate, say 50 gallons of water, and then you're washing a lot of produce in there, where you can imagine if there was a pathogen in that water, it coming off into that wash water. And if you don't change that water often, those pathogens then might be spreading to your other items that you put in that same water. So that's why I do recommend people, if you're using a dump tank type system, to use some sort of sanitizer. And again, it just really helps to prevent that cross-contamination. So what do sanitizers, what they don't do is they're not going to make dirty water clean. And in fact, if your water looks like that water that's on the left that you're washing produce in, there's no sanitizer in the world that even will work very well in that quality of water, because this organic matter, especially products like chlorine and chlorine dioxide, they get used up very quickly by organic matter. So you could dump a ton of chlorine in there and it's just not going to be effective anyway. They don't kill all of the bacteria equally. That's true. Some target some bacteria better than others, so that's true. They can manage biofilms though. So these biofilms are when bacteria get into an area and they start secreting these compounds that almost makes like a little house for them. And so it protects them wherever they are. And if that allows to happen, if they're there long enough and they can make this strong house, it's really hard to get rid of them. So you really have to have some sort of mechanical force, like brushing to get rid of them. But if you're constantly sanitizing these food contact surfaces, you're not going to see that buildup of biofilms. Well, you may, but that is not going to happen as a higher frequency. And sanitizers don't sterilize the product surface. So they're going to remove some of the bacteria there, but they're not going to kill everything that's on the surface. So don't think that's what a sanitizer could do. So really, a lot of the sanitizers, in particular chlorine, are affected by temperature, turbidity, and pH. And so temperature, pH is probably the most impactful with chlorine, because chlorine's good at a very narrow pH range of about 6.5 to 7.5. So if you're on either side, if your water has a pH on either side of that, the efficacy or how well that sanitizer can kill the bacteria just decreases. And also, like we talked about, turbidity. So turbidity just means how dirty your water is. And so like that one bucket that was on the left, that's going to have a very high turbidity. So versus that clear one would have a low turbidity. So like Scott already said, the label is the law. And here you can see, and this is kind of small to read, but over in the directions for use, it needs to say something about what you're trying to use that sanitizer for. So for example, just normal chlorine, like bleach, Clorox bleach that we buy at the grocery store, that is labeled for food contact surfaces. So it says on there, it gives you instructions on how to use it for food contact surfaces. So if you're using it to say to wash your harvest tools or your harvest bins, or to sanitize your harvest bins, your packing table, whatever, that's totally fine. But that same Clorox bleach does not have a label for washing fruits and vegetables. So there are some special ones that do. We were told there is a Clorox product that you can find at Home Depot and Menards that is labeled for fruit and vegetable washing. But just make sure that it has that label. It has to say somewhere what the purpose, has a label for the purpose that you're wanting to use it for. And it should tell you how to use it, how to dispose of it, any precautions that you need to take while using the sanitizer. All right, let's play. Do I need a sanitizer? So the first, you're washing radishes in a sink with running water from a faucet. Water's potable. Do I need to put a sanitizer in there? And you can just unmute yourself, shout out, put it in the chat. What do you guys think? No. Yes, correct. We got some no's. That is right. So no, there's no reason for it, right? You have potable water. You're not reusing this water for anything, so there's no reason to add a sanitizer. All right, so wash line sprays water and peppers as they go by on a conveyor. The water is not reused and the water is potable. Should I add a sanitizer to that? So you go ahead, you can put that in the chat. Unmute yourself. Yep, I got a no, and that is correct. Good job. Yes. So yeah, there's really no reason, right? Because we're not reusing this water. It's potable, so we should be good. So the third one, lettuce is dunked in tubs of cold water. Sorry, that's my dog. The first tub removes most of the dirt. The second tub removes the rest. The water is potable at the start, but we're reusing it for several batches. Should I put a sanitizer? Yes. Yes, you guys are right. I see yes in the chat. Very good. So again, the real thing here, why we're using a sanitizer is that we're reusing that water. And so it's always a good idea. And there's nothing saying that's bad. I'm not trying to make it sound like batch water or dump tanks are bad, but it's just, there is that risk there. And so adding that sanitizer is just a good idea. All right, so it's 3:07. How about we take just a quick 5-minute break? So come back at like 2 after. And then Terry will pick up on the waste part. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I did that wrong. I was looking at the clock over there. So what is it? 5 after, so it's what? 12, 3:12, sorry. All right, we're at 3:12. So Terry, if you want to kick it off, I don't know if you want to. I think people are coming on their way back.
Yep. We'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully people have started to make their way back. So this next section, we're going to be talking about waste and specifically manure use, if that's something that you are doing or plan to do. And I do want to preface this by saying the message today is not going to be, don't use manure. That's a common kind of misconception when people start thinking about food safety. They think they can't use manure, and that's certainly not the case. The important thing is to understand the risks associated with manure use, and then ways that we can mitigate those risks in our practices and also our selection of soil amendments and things like that. So the overall goal when we are using manure or animal waste as a fertilizer is just to prevent that transfer of human pathogens that could be in manure, prevent that transfer of pathogens to our produce, and just being smart about how we are using manure and animal waste. So all manures, regardless of the species that it is coming from, can carry human pathogens. And sometimes when we work with growers, they think that because they're using manure from a certain animal that there is not risk associated with that, and that's just simply not true. All manures can carry human pathogens, although we do see some animals associated with certain pathogens more than others. So for example, Salmonella could be associated with poultry, where E. coli is commonly associated with species like cattle. So there are also lots of other things that can affect what pathogens and how many pathogens animals are shedding in their manure, such as the age of the animal, rearing practices, diet, the season, and then also environmental conditions as well. So lots of different things going into this and factoring that risk associated with manure. So what's the risk here? When we start applying manure to the soil, those pathogens in that manure could spread to the plants from waste amended soil, especially if it directly contacts the harvestable portion of the crop. Next slide. So one thing to consider if you are using manure or plan to use manure in the future is the timing. When are you putting that manure on the soil or incorporating it into the soil? And there are a couple different options here as far as application while still considering risk reduction. So one option, and the one that we tend to recommend the most, is applying the manure in the fall before a cover crop or to a cover crop and before the ground freezes. So there is quite a bit of a window there, but that window allows those pathogens to die off in the soil before that harvestable portion of the crop is really there and it's not that close to harvest. And keep in mind, when we're talking about this application interval here, we're talking about untreated manure. This is raw manure that has not gone through any type of a composting step or anything like that. Another option, if you are using raw manure, is to apply that or incorporate that into the soil in the spring, or apply it to an agronomic crop, so something that is not fresh produce, the season directly before vegetables. And that can be tricky just because you want to have at least 90 to 120 days between application and then the harvest of the produce. As you guys are aware here, that means that you're going to have to apply soil amendments in that very, very early spring. And a lot of times our ground is still frozen around then. So it can be tricky trying to go the spring route in order to give that 90 to 120 day application interval. And those intervals come from the National Organic Program standards. So what National Organic Program says is if you are applying raw manure to the soil for a crop that grows off the ground, you need at least 90 days between application and harvest. And then if you have a crop that grows on or near the ground, you need at least 120-day application interval between application and harvest. So keep that in mind. If you are planning on using raw manure, you definitely have to plan ahead. You don't want to apply that manure after that crop is already growing, and especially not after the harvestable portion is there. So let's say that that's not possible for you to have that maximum amount of time. So another option here would be applying treated manure. So if the manure is properly treated, it may be applied at any time in accordance with good nutrient management practices. So you don't need that 90 to 120 days if it's properly treated. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and what constitutes treated versus just raw manure. So you have this picture here of this pile, and the question is it manure or is it compost? And this is a common question that there's sometimes debate between growers. And what we want to make sure everyone understands is just because you have a pile of manure that's been sitting there for a while, that does not mean that it is composted. That is considered raw manure. So there's a legal definition for composted manure. And this is defined in the National Organic Program. And what we're talking about here, so real compost that fits this definition has gone through some type of a step that's going to adequately reduce those pathogens in that manure. And usually this is done using some kind of thermophilic process, so heat. A common one that is defined in the FSMA produce safety rule, and I believe in the National Organic Program as well, is that your manure has been at a temperature of 131 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 3 days. And then that's also followed by a curing step where that temperature goes down. So of course, in order to prove that that your manure has gone through a proper composting step, you have to verify the temperature and verify the time that it's been at that temperature. So there's a lot that goes into this in order to make sure that that manure has gone through a step to adequately reduce the pathogens in that. All right, so after your manure has been composted, it's gone through that step, and it's finished compost, it needs to be protected from contamination. So you see in this photo here, this manure pile is covered by a tarp. There's nothing saying you have to cover it, but that's definitely a good practice in order to keep animals out of there and also prevent it blowing away or anything like that. You also want to try and keep track of the tools or things that you are using to handle raw manure versus finished compost. You want to try and prevent that cross-contamination if you can with cleaning or with designation of tools for certain uses. So yeah, there are several different considerations there. The big one, you really want to try and keep animals out, because if animals get into finished compost, then that could, of course, make that now untreated manure if they get in there and contaminate that. All right, so another option here, if it's not possible for you to compost your own manure, you can have somebody else do that. Let me shut this door real quick. So you can have somebody else compost that for you, or you can buy treated manure. But if you're doing that, just make sure you know what that supplier is doing as far as composting. Make sure that they're following some type of scientifically validated process. If you are covered by the produce safety rule, You want to request documentation from that supplier showing that they've followed that process. And then another consideration, yes, it does run downhill. So the big thing here is we want to store our manure in a place and in a way that there's not runoff from that onto our produce fields or into a packing area. And another consideration is we don't want it to run off into irrigation water. So there has been evidence of outbreaks in the past occurring because there's runoff from manure or from livestock operations into irrigation water, and then that goes all over the produce. So you can, think about where you're storing it. You can also put things in place like berms or diversion ditches to try and make sure that that's not running onto the produce. Some other animal byproducts that you can use as a soil amendment include blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, fish emulsion. All of those things are animal byproducts. So if you are purchasing those, check the manufacturer's process for a chemical or thermal kill step. Because it is of animal origin, you still want to make sure that that is processed in a way to reduce pathogens. You want to prevent contamination with manure. And then another note on here, just because something is OMRI approved does not mean that it's microbiologically safe. And that's a common misconception. And all OMRI approved means is that it's good for organic production. It doesn't mean that it's food safe or it's gone through any sort of kill steps. So make sure you just keep those two things separate. All right, and then wanted to mention biosolids as well. So biosolids is what is left after you treat human sewage. And we do not recommend you use biosolids on produce that is going to be sold. A lot of buyers and consumers just absolutely do not want it. So that you have that. And then also there are risks associated with biosolids, of course, pathogens, and also things like heavy metals and things like that. And another thing to think about, if you are growing produce close to your home, know where that septic system is. You want to try to avoid planting anything right above that septic system. The roots can get into that and then soak up things in that septic system, and pathogens can be internalized in the plant. So you want to try and avoid that and just know where those things are. And last note in this section, we wanted to mention aquaponics. And we're seeing more and more growers try this. So aquaponics is a two-part system where we're dealing with fish production and then also vegetable production. So the fish kind of provide that fertilizer for the water that goes to the plants, and then the clean filtered water goes back to the fish. So you have this nice system here. Now, go ahead and go to the next slide, Scott. So systems should be designed, if you are using aquaponics, systems should be designed to minimize splashing onto the edible plant parts. And then you also want to make sure that you're testing water frequently for the presence of human pathogens. This is an area of production that is still being researched, so we don't have a whole lot of best practice recommendations yet, but this is what we have so far, and we just want to try and make sure that we're monitoring if there is that contamination event where human pathogens do get into the water, that we identify that and can address that if that does occur.
Okay. So we have a question, Terry. What about nematodes added to the soil?
So Scott or Amanda, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Well, in all honesty, most of the time when I think of nematodes, I don't think of beneficials. So if there's beneficial nematodes out there, that's awesome. And really, adding nematodes, I really don't know that there's a whole lot of risk there. it's more of a microscopic life form. So I can't see that you would be introducing a whole lot of risk. I think probably the key here is going to be to work with your supplier or whoever you're getting the material from. Make sure you understand how those are produced, how they're reared, and making sure that that supplier is doing so in such a way that they're not accidentally introducing something into the system with the nematodes. I guess I would be more concerned about what's possibly introduced with the nematodes than I would be the nematodes themselves.
Yeah, same. That would be my response. And the other question we had was about bag soil and potting soil, and I'm assuming cocoa. I mean, that's the coconut husk. I'm assuming. So what about the issues with that? And I can answer that if so. Really, most of those things that you buy, the suppliers have gotten really good now. They know they need to give you those tests results. So you should be able to ask them for that, and you just keep that they tell you how they treated it. Usually it's some sort of autoclave where it's a high enough pressure and temperature to kill any of the bacteria that's present, and they'll give you that certificate of analysis. So if you're buying any of that stuff commercially, that should be available and not a problem. Go ahead, Terry.
Oh, I was just going to mention one thing that I didn't touch on very much, and one practice we do see is growers using vegetative soil amendments. So things that are not of animal origin, so cold produce or things, waste from the garden or out of date vegetables or anything like that. And as far as the risks associated with vegetative waste, we don't see those risks that we see with animals. So you don't need to apply those same application intervals, and that stuff does not need to go through that proven compost step that we need to see with manure. So that's something else to consider.
Yeah, good point, Terry. Scott, do you want to do wildlife or you want me to take it?
Yeah, I can take it. We'll talk a little bit now about wildlife and other animals. When we think about wildlife, basically what we're talking about are any animals, including pets and livestock, that are in or near the production area and not under the direct control of the producer. So that really means just about any type of animal other than perhaps draft animals or work animals. What's the risk?
Sorry, the question. So a lot of discussion at small farms about permaculture, grazing chickens over fields before crops, or rotating cows and goats. How long between?
Well, we'll touch on that. Generally, I would like to, again, to my way of thinking, just to go ahead and answer that. I think it kind of goes back to what Terry talked about earlier with a good rule of thumb being the 90 to 120 days that are outlined in the National Organic Program. Especially if you're incorporating that, really ideally, if you could move the livestock off midwinter or even late fall, if you could incorporate that, get a cover crop on it, that would be ideal. But really, if you're grazing it, then at that point, it's really, in my mind, not a whole lot different than a manure application, albeit the manure application is in slow motion in this case. But yeah, you would probably want to go ahead and wait out that 90 to 120 days just to give that bacteria time in the soil to degrade, for those microbe levels to drop. The nice thing, though, is that if you look at some of these pathogens, like the E. coli's and whatnot, in good, healthy soil, they're generally not strong competitors. So if you've got good, healthy soil to begin with, that's going to help the good guys kind of outcompete the bad guys, and it's going to increase that rate at which the potential pathogens are diminished from the soil. Okay, hope that answered it. So, but with animals, really the risk is that they can introduce pathogens or other materials into the production areas. And I use the example, I encourage people, ask yourself, do I really want to eat what the dog just rolled in, or some of the things that I've seen the dog get into? Because in a lot of cases, that's exactly what they're going to be bringing into the production area if they're allowed to roam the field unchecked. So how do we manage wildlife? Well, basically, we want to monitor populations and then apply interventions when the population introduces excessive risk into the system. So again, it boils down to monitoring and being aware of what's out there in those fields. I tell people I don't get too concerned in Indiana if I see a set of deer tracks going across my field. If I see 20 or 30 sets of tracks, then I'm going to get really concerned because we've started to take on more risk than we really need to have. So again, monitoring is going to be key. During the growing season, monitor for feces, evidence of intrusion, evaluate the risk of fecal contamination on produce. If you've got wildlife going through the field and you're growing watermelons, the risk of contamination is going to be a lot higher than if you were growing apples. Consider past observations, things that might be in the area that's attracting the wildlife. And again, this becomes really important as we get close to harvest. The closer we get to harvest, the more risk we take on from animal intrusion. So immediately prior to harvest, we want to make sure that we're monitoring for fecal contamination, signs of activity. And then if we do find signs of activity, we need to assess the risk and decide if the crop or a portion of the crop can still be safely harvested. One thing that we do stress is that wildlife management does not equal wildlife elimination. Our management decisions are based on risk. So we're trying to manage wildlife, or in many cases co-manage, not necessarily eliminate the wildlife. And that means striking a balance. That means trying to address food safety requirements, but keeping conservation of natural resources in mind. I know when we talk about in some of our classes, whenever people first became aware of some of the risk from wildlife, there were some growers that decided to just eliminate wildlife habitat around their farms. And the truth of the matter is it didn't work out so well. If you take out all of the habitat and suddenly your field is the only thing green for a half a mile all the way around, well, guess where everyone's going to go for the next meal. So again, we try to think in terms of co-management, making sure we've got healthy habitat so that the animals aren't necessarily attracted to our field as much. How do we deter wildlife? How do we discourage it? Decoys are useful. You can see the coyote, the owl, the swan. For some reason, geese don't like swans. So decoys can be effective for a little while. Fencing and netting can also be effective. I joke that in our neck of the woods, that fence would have to be about 1.5 feet higher if it were going to keep that deer out. But again, the thing to remember when we're dealing with wildlife is that they're very adaptable. So we may end up using 2 or 3 different management techniques during the season. Noise deterrents can be effective. Propane cannons, we use those down here in the southwest part of the state quite a bit for sweet corn production to help keep birds out of sweet corn. Tactiles, repellents, visual deterrents. There's been some research that suggests that these inflatables, like you see at the used car lots, are fairly effective in deterring wildlife because of the constant motion. The challenge, of course, is running an extension cord to the back 40 so that you can plug them in. Relocation is another option. Just be aware that if you're relocating animals, sometimes you have to go a pretty good distance. Raccoons, you'll have to take those at least 5 miles before they're far enough that they won't come back. So again, relocation is one method, but it's maybe not the best method, depending on where you're relocating the animals. If you're using draft animals for production, we get that question occasionally. If animals are not supposed to be in the field, how do the Amish get away with using those horses? And the truth of the matter is that it's the same old story. You identify a risk, you develop a plan for mitigating the risk, you work the plan, evaluate, document, and if it's not working, you try something else. So how do we reduce risk with draft animals? Well, growers might have wide harvest lanes so that if an animal would happen to defecate, it's not going to land on a crop plant. They could even sow grass in those harvest lanes or keep the animals out of the field 14 days prior to harvest. They could stable the work animals apart from other animals. There's been a little bit of research that shows that horses are less likely to shed E. coli if they're stabled away from ruminants. They might carry a bucket and shovel and immediately remove anything that comes out of the horses and then quarantine the area with flags. So again, there's techniques you can use to mitigate your risk even if you're using draft animals. So let's talk a little bit about workers and other people.
Yeah, I can take that one. Scott?
Yeah, by all means.
All right. So workers, unfortunately, we can do all these good things for the food safety practices and good ag practices, but a sick worker can undo a lot of things very quickly. So they could, in fact, be the source of the pathogens that contaminate the produce. So we know humans can carry these human pathogens. They can spread the pathogens, so from their hands from their clothing onto the produce. And really, we need to focus on making sure our workers know that they can be a risk, and so that you provide them training so they know how to wash their hands and how to handle any illness and injury that may come up. So examples of poor hygiene may include improper hand washing practices. So, one thing that we always say is make sure if you're asking them to wash their hands with soap and water and dry their hands on a disposable paper towel, that those things are available at all times to them, because we want to make sure that we're supporting their efforts in hand washing. Because I do feel, we've been preaching about hand washing forever. And I feel now with COVID, it's like people are finally, it's taking on and they're actually doing it. So that's a good thing. And dirty restrooms too is an example of poor hygiene. So we get this question a lot too. So can hand sanitizers alone replace hand washing? And no, it can't. So you can't sanitize a dirty surface. So just like we talked about before with sanitizers, just in wash water, those sanitizers, same deal, they get used up very quickly if there's a lot of organic matter present. So if your hands are super dirty and you're putting hand sanitizer on there, they're not going to be doing as good a job as if you had clean hands. So you do want to wash your hands before applying hand sanitizer. And so then here's just, now I think everybody kind of knows the whole hand washing thing, but you need to make sure you wash your hands for 20 seconds. So when must hands be washed? Basically, this is anytime you change activities. So after using the toilet, returning to work, eating, smoking, putting on gloves. So again, let me just state, there's not a requirement that you use gloves on your farm. You may choose to do so. So you may have, say, during harvest, you do use gloves. There's nothing saying you have to. You can just have a hand washing policy so that your employees follow all these, or you follow all these steps. So when you wash your hands if any of your activities change, so you don't need to do gloves. All right, so cleaning and sanitizing. So first, these are just the steps, and we'll go through them briefly. So we want to pre-rinse, so we're getting any of the big debris off. So this would be like the plant material, soil, things like that. And then we're going to need to wash the surface with a detergent. And so typically you're going to want some sort of scrubbing action. So just like we talked, so this would be like for your food contact surfaces, harvest tools, harvest bins, things like that. We do want some sort of scrubbing action, at least, on a semi-regularly basis. So maybe once a week, maybe this isn't something you're doing every day, but maybe every other day. But you do want to have some scrubbing action because that's how you're going to break up those biofilms. And so if you never do that, the likelihood you're going to get some biofilms that are going to be there and be persistent is a problem. So you do want some sort of scrubbing action. Then a rinse step, we're getting rid of the detergent, and then the final sanitizer step. So that's just coming in and killing any of those remaining bacteria that could be present. But again, we want to make sure we're following the label. So restrooms, we want to make sure that our employees have it. We get the question a lot, does it have to be this separate porta pot? And the answer is no, it can be in your house, but you have to make sure that you have at least, this is per OSHA guidelines, you have to have one restroom for every 20 employees. And that restroom has to be within a quarter mile from where they're working, and then regularly cleaned and documented. So I think this quarter mile or within 10 minutes of walking, so if you can get them within 10 minutes by car, if that's an option, then it could be probably a little bit farther away. But that's with the toilets. Oh, that's good, Scott. So proper use of toilets, we want to make sure that people are using them, that they're not going out in the fields, and that's why you make them accessible. So if it's the hard thing to do is to use the toilet, they're not going to do that. So make it easy. We also want to make sure that they're putting toilet paper in the toilet and not in the garbage can next to the toilet. And so in a lot of cultures, their septic systems just can't handle that much toilet paper in it. And so they will never flush the toilet paper. And so we don't want to keep that here. We have no issues with that. And it's much more sanitary to flush the toilet paper, and then always wash your hands. So worker clothing, again, you just want to make sure they're clean. And footwear, especially if you have a diversified farm where you're doing a lot, you have animals, and then you're going in and harvesting. So footwear can become an issue because you're going in between those two spaces. So a lot of growers will just have a couple pair of boots. So one's designated for the animals, one's designated when they're working with the produce. So gloves, like I said, if you do use them, you want to make sure that you get rid of them when if they're become torn, or they must be changed after they're contaminated. And then if they're reusable gloves, just make sure you get them on some sort of cleaning schedule, because we want to make sure they're as clean as possible. And then aprons, gloves, or any other equipment should be removed before you're going into the toilet. So if somebody's wearing an apron, we don't want them to take that apron with them into the bathroom facility. You need to remove it. Usually there's a spot, have hooks or something outside the bathroom so that they can do that. So worker health, this is always, I think this industry always suffers from this, because a lot of it is, if you don't show up to work, you're not going to get paid. And that's just how a lot of the ag industry is organized. And so if they're sick, they're going to still try to come to work, but we do not want them handling produce. So if they come in and they're sick, vomiting, diarrhea, have them do something else. Have them do don't have them directly handle that produce that you're selling. So here's just some common signs of foodborne illness. So diarrhea, we talked about it, nausea, vomiting, cramps, muscle aches, headaches. So these are all just the general characteristics of a foodborne illness. So some sort of bacterial, it could be a viral, like norovirus infection, but these are just very common symptoms. So if you have an employee that's experiencing any of this, they should not be working directly with the produce. They can do something else, but not handling the produce. And we already kind of touched on this. Why would you come to work sick? Well, most of the time, if you don't have sick pay or sick leave, you may not have health insurance. And sometimes you just have to get the work done, right? Sometimes that just has to be done, and there's no other way around it. But again, just try to have them do other things. So worker injury, you do want to make sure you have a first aid kit and that it's well stocked and monitored. I mean, I have one of these in my lab, and I swear every time I have a cut, there's never a Band-Aid in it. So we don't do a good job at monitoring the first aid kit. You want to make sure it's stocked and clean and bandage all wounds. So if they have a cut on their hand, you want to make sure you clean it, you bandage it, and then they need to wear a glove over that bandage. So any product that has been contaminated with blood, we want to get rid of it. It's not worth it to try to sell that, because if something comes up and it gets traced back to that produce, it's bad news. And we want to make sure we clean and sanitize any items that have come into contact with any bodily fluids. Again, just to make sure we're cleaning all that up. And it's a good idea to have a training program at least once a year. And this can be something that's, very simple, that you just go through a check. You have a list of things you want to talk to your workers about. Then you have a piece of paper and you describe what you talked about, and you have them sign their name to that paper once a year. And that's your worker training program. And that is a good thing to do yearly. And that just gets everybody on board, that everybody's familiar with what the practices are, what they're supposed to do, what their expectations are, and if there's any problems, who they're reporting those problems to. So again, here's just some examples of what that training program should include. And so you can see health practices, basic sanitation policies, how to wash your hands, any of your farm specific procedures. So how do you run your business, location of the facilities, where are the restrooms, things like that. So just have something like that you cover in this. It could be a 10-15 minute training. And I will say, on our website, we do have a link to a video. So it's about 15 minutes long, and it's called Food Safety Begins on the Farm. And it just gives us a 15-minute basic good ag practices. And it's in a couple different languages, Spanish, I think, and Creole. But it's you can set them down, put it on the computer, let them watch it, and then they sign that form. So it can be very simple to do, but I think they do a good job in that video. All right, so I think we got a question. Oh, great, Terry.
That was me.
Yep, perfect, thank you.
Yeah, so I posted a link to the Safe Produce Indiana website that includes the links to all 3 of those Food Safety Begins on the Farm videos. So feel free to use those as part of your training program if you'd like. Okay, so this last little part, I'll try to go through it quickly so we have a little bit of time for questions, but it's just about putting it all together. So we talked about water, waste, wildlife, and workers. So now we encourage you guys to start thinking about, what does this look like on your farm? And ask the question, what are some easy and quick ways to decrease the risk of contamination by a foodborne pathogen on your farm? So think about the risk on your farm. Go through the steps of what things look like, and we'll give you some things to consider here at each one of the steps in your growing process. But this is the best way to kind of act proactively and make sure that you take care of that low-hanging fruit as far as food safety risk goes, and then and go about it that way. And one thing we encourage you, when you're kind of putting together a plan of what you want to do, what food safety risks you want to address, don't look at it as a list of 20 things, and just because that will just overwhelm you. Try to break it down and take care of one thing at a time. Look at, okay, what would introduce the largest risk on my farm, and rank your risks and go about it that way. And also look at, okay, what would take the least amount of investment, the least amount of time, what can I take care of right now? So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So some pre-plant considerations that you may want to think about. Site selection. So where are you planting your crops? Think about things like where livestock operations may be to decrease that risk of runoff. Also where floodplains might be. You want to try and avoid planting in an area that floods frequently because that can present food safety risk as well. Field preparation, also things like manure use. Are you using manure? Are you using treated compost versus raw manure? Transplant production, are you producing your own transplants? And if you are, what risks could there be in that process? As far as planting goes, so if you're getting transplants from someone else and you're purchasing those from a greenhouse somewhere, are you aware of the practices that they're using and possible food safety risks? Seed source. So if you're saving your own seeds, are you doing that in a way to try and reduce that risk of pathogens growing? Field sanitation, going back, and what we're talking about here is what Amanda was talking about with workers and worker hygiene. Do you have toilet facilities out by your fields and hand wash facilities readily available? And then worker sanitation, are they trained as far as what good hygiene and good sanitation practices are out in the field? Some growing considerations. Once again, worker hygiene, that's going to be a common theme throughout this your entire process. Are your workers trained? Do they know what good hygiene practices look like? Wildlife monitoring. Do you have a lot of wildlife activity where your fields are? And can you mitigate that in any way? How are you using water during your growing activities? Is that being applied directly to the produce, or are you using something like drip tape? And then equipment. What equipment are you using? Is it in good shape? Could it present any type of risk? Some harvest considerations. Once again, worker sanitation and worker training. Do workers know to look for animal feces when they're harvesting? Are they making sure that they're using clean harvest containers and washing their hands beforehand? Wildlife monitoring. Once again, you should never harvest anything that's contaminated with feces, with animal feces. So ensuring that you see that through on your farm. Transport vehicles should be kept clean and should be in good repair so that doesn't present any type of risk. And then equipment sanitation as well, especially think about things like harvest knives. It's a good idea to have those on a regular sanitation schedule or even designate them for use for produce contact or food contact. And then post-harvest considerations, there are quite a few of these. So think about things like proper equipment washing and storage. So you probably don't want to store those all over the ground like the picture and then just go use them. You probably want to store them off the ground and make sure they're on a regular sanitation schedule. If you're using sanitizers for your cleaning process, or if you're using sanitizer in the water, make sure that you're using it according to the label, and the label is the law, so don't forget that. A few other post-harvest considerations. If you are receiving at your facility, are you making sure that you're handling produce in a safe way and it's going where it needs to go quickly? Product flow. So we always recommend that there's kind of a one-way flow of product through a pack house. So you receive in from the field at one end and you ship it out of the other end or store it at the other end. Packing house sanitation, all of that equipment in that packing house should be on some type of a sanitation schedule. And what that is up to you, how often you want to clean, but you do want to make sure that you are cleaning, especially anything that's contacting produce directly. And then transport to market. Think about your transportation vehicles, your transportation containers. What is that produce touching? And is that being cleaned at any type of a frequency? So think about your risks associated with transport as well. A few other considerations. Water. So if you are washing your produce right now, do you need to do that? Is there a possibility that the way that you're washing your produce is actually presenting more of a risk than if you just didn't wash it all? Are you doing that because a customer told you to? Are you doing it just because your produce is extremely dirty? So just think about it that way. Think about what Amanda talked about earlier with post-harvest water. Are you testing your water? And are sanitizers needed? And those are all things that those are all calls that you're going to need to make on your farm. And then market considerations. I'm guessing a lot of you guys sell at farmers markets or roadside stands, or just markets in general. So think about things like traceability. We encourage everybody to know where their produce is going, just one step forward. You don't have to know the last person that has that produce, just one step forward and then one step back. What field did it come from? That's what we're talking about when we say one step back. That's usually the easy part. The one step forward is a little bit more difficult. So figure out how you want to do that on your farm. Displays. So try to keep produce off the ground and make sure that you're not presenting some sort of risk in the way you're displaying your produce at the market. It's probably a good idea to limit how much that customers are handling the product as well. And pets and wildlife too. Think about them at the market if they are allowed. And then if you're at a farmer's market, what's the role of your market master? So if there's any sort of food safety risk or hazard that you identify at your market, you want to bring that to your market master's attention so that they know what's going on and so it can be addressed. Because if it's a risk to you, it's most likely a risk to other people as well. So just ask yourself how those things look at your market, and also how all of these things look on your farm. Like I said, produce safety is all about identifying and dealing with risk and knowing what that risk looks like on your farm, because no two farms are the same. You're the one that knows your farm the best. So you can't just 100% copy what somebody else is doing. You have to think about your farm in terms of risk. Okay, so we're to the end of the presentation. I hope this was helpful for folks. So now we can take any questions. We do have a couple minutes. I did go through that last section a little quickly because we were short on time, so.
I have a quick question that it goes beyond the scope of this presentation, but I'm wondering if maybe y'all have some resources, which is any general recommendations on, I suppose best practices would be included in this, but also for safety purposes, but efficiency as well, in terms of like ideas on how to both safely and efficiently or most quickly wash different types of produce. For example, like differences between root vegetables and salad greens. And things like that. I know that goes beyond the scope of today, but the safety plus efficiency is something we're trying to work out in our flow from field to post-harvest to end consumer right now.
Yeah, I mean, I can start, but others can chime in. So yeah, so I would say with your root vegetables, those you probably, if you can set up, which I've seen a lot, people set up just like a metal grate where the water can go through and then just spraying them. I think that's probably the best, just because you're going to have a lot of dirt. And I think if you're doing a dump tank, you would be changing that water all the time. And I think it'd just be a huge pain in the butt. Okay. But leafy greens, if you can look into them. So just setting up a 3-bay sink. So kind of like that one picture that we had with a guy from holding up the lettuce. If you can set up a 3-bay sink, we recommend, so water, and then a sanitizer. If it doesn't need to be rinsed, or if that sanitizer does need to be rinsed like chlorine does, so water, chlorine, water. And then if you can invest in one, they make these bigger, so some are just by hand, but some are also a mechanical. They're just like big centrifuges, and they dry those greens like awesome.
Okay.
So if you can invest, so you can see there's some that they sell that are like $100, right? But then there's the big commercial ones, they're like 2,500, right?
Yeah. Okay. So in general, water, sanitize, dry.
Yep. Yep. And again, if you can get away with not washing it, then see what you're.
That's why I'm
Test
hoping
it
to do
out.
some consumer education.
Mm-hmm. And you know what I tell people? Sometimes a lot of times, the shelf life is actually extended if you don't get those products wet.
Yeah.
So you can take it from that. If your buyers will take that line of argument why you don't wash it, you say, hey, you take it home and then you wash it. It's going to last in your fridge a lot longer than compared to I washed it. That is usually a pretty good selling point.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Have you guys had anything to add to that?
One thing I might add, I think it's on, we've got it posted on a link on our website, but we did that video about a year ago with Michigan State on hygienic design. And basically it shows principles of hygienic design, and it shows some of the equipment that we have down here at our training hub. Granted, no two farms are going to have the same equipment, but as a starting point for, certain concepts as far as hygienic design and how to configure, a packing or washing process, that might also be a helpful resource.
Yeah, and as you guys, sound like some of you guys are just getting started too. We always say with these events, we hope this isn't the last time we see you. So please reach out to any one of us, and we can, if you have questions on design or how you want to, how you're marketing something or whatever, we're happy to help you with all that.
And I'm putting my contact info in the chat box. Amanda and Scott, if you wanted to do the same, and you guys feel free to reach out to us at any time, and we can come out to farms too. That's something we do. If that's something, especially if you think you might be covered by this Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule. If that's something down the road you think you'll be covered by, let us know and we can help you prep for that.
All right, thanks guys. And let us know if you have any questions. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Great job. Thanks.